Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're casting a wide net, not really looking at the fish themselves, but more at the people, the crowds who go after them.
That's right. We're focusing on why people do, or maybe more importantly these days, don't go recreational fishing, especially in, highly developed countries.
And we're grounding this discussion in a really key piece of research.
Yep. This is our deep dive into the 2014 paper explaining participation rates in recreational fishing across industrialized countries. The lead author is Robert Arlinghaus, working with several colleagues.
And their goal was, what? To figure out the big picture, like the societal forces at play.
Exactly. To move past just asking individuals, why do you fish? And look at these macro-level factors. What in society itself encourages or discourages fishing?
And the numbers involved are pretty staggering, aren't they?
They really are. Their initial look across 27 industrialized nations found, on average, about 10.5% of the population fishes recreationally.
10.5%. That translates to, what, over 100 million people?
Yeah, their estimate was around 118 million people just in North America, Europe, and Oceania. A huge user base.
And this is the core issue they tackle, right?
Yeah.
That number, in many wealthy countries, seems to be shrinking.
Precisely. That's the puzzle. Why is interest apparently declining in these very places where people theoretically have more leisure time and resources?
Yeah.
That's what we're digging into.
Okay, before we dive deeper, let's clarify terms. When they say recreational fishing, what exactly does that cover?
Good point. The paper is clear. It's fishing for aquatic animals, but not primarily for food, like subsistence fishing, and definitely not for commercial sale.
So purely for leisure, sport, fun. Got it.
And understanding these participation rates isn't just, a trivial pursuit. It has real-world consequences.
For who? Businesses, obviously, right? Tackle shops, boat manufacturers.
Sure, the fishing industry, tourism, definitely. But maybe the most critical stakeholders are the fisheries management agencies themselves.
Because their funding often comes from license sales.
Exactly. In many places, license fees are a primary revenue stream for conservation, for stocking programs, for research. So if participation drops,
Their funding model takes a direct hit,
Mm-hmm.
which impacts conservation efforts for everyone. Okay, I see the link.
Right. So even if you don't fish yourself, understanding these trends matters for resource management.
And the paper highlights this kind of paradox you mentioned earlier, that economic development initially boosts fishing, but then it reverses.
Yeah, that's the core conflict they explore. Early on, as countries develop, people get more disposable income, maybe more defined leisure time, and fishing often takes off.
Makes sense. You can afford the gear, the travel.
But then, once a country reaches a certain level of post-industrialization, think the US, Canada, the UK, France, that interest starts to trend downwards.
So it peaks and then falls, even though people are technically even wealthier.
Right. It's like wealth creates the opportunity, but then more wealth, combined with other societal changes, starts to push people away from it. That's the decline they're trying to explain.
So how did they go about studying this? It sounds like a huge, complex social phenomena.
It is. And they realized they needed a different approach than just surveying individual anglers about, their personal feelings. They needed to see the big patterns.
And so they shifted the focus.
Yes, instead of the individual person being the unit of study, they made the country or region, like a U.S. state or Canadian province, the unit of analysis.
Comparing overall rates between these large geographic areas.
Exactly. They started with, I think it was 28 reliable national-level estimates, but to get more statistical power and capture variations within big countries.
Like between, say, coastal Florida and inland Nebraska.
Precisely. They expanded the data set by including U.S. states and Canadian provinces as separate data points. That boosted them up to N87 observations, which is a much more robust data set for finding these macro patterns.
And they were picky about the data quality you mentioned.
Very. They prioritize high-quality estimates, specifically those based on probability sampling of the general population.
Okay, what does that mean in practice, like calling random households?
Essentially, yes. Methods designed to get a representative snapshot of the entire population, not just relying on fishing license sales data.
Why is relying only on license data problematic?
Well, because license sales often miss significant groups. Young people who might not need a license, seniors who might be exempt, people fishing on private property where licenses aren't required. It can really undercount the true number of participants.
Right, so to get the real picture, you have to ask everyone, not just the people who bought a permit.
Exactly. So with the stronger data set, they set out to test 5 main hypotheses, sort of grouping potential drivers into themes.
What were those themes?
Let's see. Hypothesis 1 was about the cultural importance of fish and fishing in a society. H2 looked at urbanization. H3 covered the availability of resources, basically time and money.
Okay.
H4 dealt with the sort of perceived need for leisure, like how hard people work. And H5 was about the simple availability of fishing opportunities. Is there water nearby?
So culture, cities, resources, need for escape, and actual access. Seems comprehensive.
They tried to cover the main bases, and the results were pretty striking. Their final model, combining factors from these hypotheses, was really powerful.
How powerful.
It explained over to 60% of the variation in fishing participation rates across all those regions. It's actually quite high for this kind of large-scale social science.
Wow. So they really did find some strong predictors. And were all 5 hypotheses supported?
Yes, they all played a role, which is interesting in itself, but the way they played a role and which factors were strongest held some real surprises.
Okay, let's get into those findings. You mentioned this post-industrial decline. Which factors really drove that down?
2 big ones stood out in confirming that decline: gross domestic product, GDP per capita, and population density. Both showed a negative relationship with fishing participation in these already wealthy countries.
Okay, the GBP one is the paradox we talked about. More wealth, less fishing. How do they interpret that?
Their interpretation is that this negative correlation confirms they're observing the descending limb of the fishing participation curve.
The descending limb. Okay, break that down.
It means fishing interest seems to rise with initial economic development. People get resources, but once a country is already highly developed, further increases in wealth don't boost fishing. Instead, they correlate with decreases. The society has moved past the peak fishing point, so to speak.
And what's driving that decrease at the high wealth end?
That's where the other factors come in. It seems tied to lifestyle changes, different values, more competition for time, things that come with that very high level of development.
And population density, urbanization.
That was another strong negative driver. The more densely populated, the less fishing. And interestingly, they found this wasn't just a straight line down, it was more like an exponential decline.
Meaning the negative effect gets much stronger as cities get really packed.
Yeah, it suggests that increasing urbanization has a particularly powerful dampening effect on fishing interest. It really drops off in heavily urbanized areas.
And the paper digs into why this might be happening in these post-industrial urbanized societies, right? It's not just about not having a lake nearby.
No, they suggest deeper mechanisms are at work. One is a shift in societal values.
How so?
Well, think about historical views. Often, nature, including fish and wildlife, was seen primarily through a utilitarian lens, resources to be used, harvested for food or function. Fishing and hunting were practical skills.
Okay, and how has that changed?
In many post-industrial societies, there's a noticeable shift towards more egalitarian or preservationist views of nature. Nature is seen as something to be appreciated, conserved, maybe photographed, but not necessarily interfered with when harvested.
So the basic motivation or cultural validation for developing fishing skills might be weakening.
That seems to be part of it. Plus, there's simply way more competition for leisure time.
Right. Golfing, team sports, gyms, travel.
Exactly. As societies get wealthier, the sheer number of alternative leisure activities explodes. And many of these offer similar psychological benefits: stress relief, escape, social connection, perhaps with fewer logistical hurdles than fishing.
Like you don't need a trailer and a boat ramp for indoor climbing.
Pretty much. And then there's the big one, the videophilia hypothesis.
Videophilia. Love of screens.
Essentially, yes. The idea that the constant availability and allure of electronic entertainment, video games, streaming, social media actively competes with and potentially replaces direct engagement with nature.
So the instant gratification of the screen pulls people away from the slower, maybe more demanding experience of being outdoors.
That's the argument. It fosters a kind of disconnect from the physical environment, making activities like fishing seem less appealing or relevant, especially maybe to younger generations growing up immersed in digital worlds.
Okay, so values are shifting, cities are dense, screens are everywhere. Those are big societal headwinds. What about simple resource constraints? Like, do people just lack the time or money?
That was hypothesis 3, and yes, constraints definitely matter. They found some expected negative links. For instance, participation tended to decrease as the median age of the population went up.
Suggesting maybe physical limitations play a role for older individuals.
Could be, yeah. And also, higher unemployment rates correlated with lower fishing rates, which points towards, lack of money being a barrier. Makes sense.
But wasn't there one resource factor that had a massive impact? More than the others?
Yes. This was arguably one of the most significant findings. Under the umbrella of resource availability, they looked at average household size.
Household size, how does that connect?
It had the single largest negative effect on fishing participation in their entire model. A larger average household size was strongly linked to lower fishing rates.
Wow. Bigger families mean less fishing. Why?
The interpretation is that it points squarely at time constraints, specifically those imposed by family responsibilities.
So it's not just about personal lack of time, but the logistical complexity of family life, kids' activities, chores, coordinating schedules.
Precisely. It suggests that for many people, especially maybe in those middle life stages, the sheer demands of managing a household are the biggest barrier to finding the unstructured personal time needed for something like fishing.
That really reframes the problem, doesn't it? It's not just competing with golf, it's competing with homework, help, and grocery shopping.
It seems to be a dominant factor. Time poverty, driven by family structure, is a huge constraint. People might want to fish, but life just gets in the way.
Okay, but then there was that twist with working hours, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Part of their perceived need for leisure hypothesis.
Ah, yes. That was interesting. They found that longer average weekly working hours were actually positively related to fishing participation.
Wait, working more makes you fish more. That sounds
Yeah.
completely backward.
It does at first glance, but they had a nuance there. The average working hours in their data set were mostly below about 42 hours per week, so not extreme overwork.
Okay, so not burnout levels.
Right. And their thinking was that working moderately long hours increases the perceived psychological need for escape, for decompression, for mental rest.
Fishing provides that?
It's often cited as a primary motivator for fishing the peace, the quiet, the mental reset. So the argument is, if you work reasonably hard, you feel the need for that kind of restorative leisure more acutely, making fishing more attractive if you have the time otherwise.
That makes a certain psychological sense. The need for escape drives you to make time for it, up to a point. Okay. What about the more positive drivers? Did culture matter?
Yes, Hypothesis 1, cultural importance, was definitely supported. They found positive links between fishing rates and indicators like a country's total fish landings and its per capita fish consumption.
So, places with a strong historical or ongoing connection to fish, either commercially or culturally.
Tend to have higher recreational fishing rates.
Yeah.
It suggests a kind of cultural inertia or legacy. If fishing is just part of what we do in a society, that baseline interest persists more strongly, even against those modern pressures.
How strong was that cultural link?
Pretty strong. They noted that in some analyses, just looking at per capita fish consumption alone could explain a very large chunk of the variation in fishing rates, over 70% in one reduced data set.
Wow. So that historical tie to the water is really powerful.
It seems to be a significant anchor.
Right.
Now, compare that to Hypothesis 5, the actual availability of fishing opportunities.
Like how much freshwater area or coastline a country has.
Exactly. They looked at variables like that. And while those factors were positively related to fishing, it helps to have water.
Naturally.
Their influence was surprisingly modest compared to the socioeconomic and demographic factors we've been discussing.
So having lots of lakes and rivers is good, but it's not the main thing determining if people actually fish.
That's what the data suggests. The social constraints, lack of time, especially due to family size, the pull of urbanization, competing activities, seem to be much stronger determinants than simply whether there's a place to fish nearby.
That's a critical insight for managers, isn't it? Building more boat ramps might not be the answer if people fundamentally don't have the time to use them.
Precisely. It suggests the bottleneck often isn't the resource availability, it's the human availability and motivation. People often cite lack of time long before they cite lack of access.
Okay, so pulling this all together, we had this picture of fishing declining in wealthy nations due to urbanization, value shifts, intense competition for time, especially family time. But it's anchored somewhat by cultural history and the psychological need for escape. What are the big takeaways for, say, policymakers or fisheries managers?
Well, the study acknowledges its limitations, of course. It's correlational, so it shows links, not definitive cause and effect. It's heavily weighted towards Western industrialized nations, so you can't necessarily generalize to developing countries.
Yeah.
And it doesn't capture individual motivations or deeper cultural values, nuances.
Sure, standard caveats for this kind of large-scale study.
Right. But despite that, the conclusion is pretty stark. Given these deep-seated societal trends driving the decline, you can't just expect things to stay the same or fix themselves.
Meaning active intervention is needed.
Yes. The paper argues strongly that dedicated management actions and, importantly, professional marketing are required to counteract these trends and potentially reverse the decline. It won't happen passively.
What kind of interventions do they suggest? They call them facilitators.
Yeah, basically things that make it easier for people to start or continue fishing. One key area is access, especially near urban centers. Making it simple and convenient for people, particularly youth, to have positive early experiences with fishing is crucial for socialization into the activity.
Get them hooked early, so to speak.
Metaphorically, yes.
Right.
And also removing structural barriers. Some places have really burdensome requirements, mandatory courses, complex exams just to get a basic license.
Making it feel like a chore before you even start.
Exactly. They argue for streamlining those processes, lowering the transaction costs of becoming a fisher, make it easy and inviting.
And the marketing piece. How does that fit in?
That connects back to the videophilia hypothesis and the competition from other leisure activities. The argument is that fishing needs to be actively and professionally marketed using modern tools and channels.
So not just relying on tradition, but actively competing for attention.
Right. Highlighting the unique benefits, the nature connection, the stress relief, the family bonding potential in ways that resonate in today's media landscape. If fishing isn't positioned effectively, it risks getting drowned out by all the other options demanding people's limited time and attention.
It sounds like a call to reimagine how fishing is promoted and managed, focusing much more on the human and social side.
I think that's a fair summary. And they end with a really interesting thought for future research.
What's that?
They suggest that maybe the most important question isn't just why people do fish, but focusing more on why such large segments of the population don't fish.
Studying the non-participants.
Yeah, really digging into the specific barriers, constraints, and perceptions from the perspective of those who aren't currently engaged. Understanding the no might be key to figuring out how to get to yes.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If you only study current anglers, you might miss the reasons why the pool is shrinking overall.
Exactly.
So the big takeaway for me, listening to this, is that the future health of recreational fishing seems less about managing fish stocks, though that's still vital, of course, and much more about navigating these complex human factors. It's about competing for relevance, time, and attention in these incredibly busy, urbanized, and digitally saturated societies.
It really shifts the focus, doesn't it? It's fundamentally a socio-economic challenge as much as an ecological one. A really fascinating look at how our modern lives shape our connection, or lack thereof, with the natural world.
Indeed. A lot to think about there. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.